Before we dive into these scary stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you enjoy true horror content every week. Let's get into it. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. My friend Sarah and I had planned a peaceful weekend getaway in a secluded cabin in the mountains, miles away from civilization. We were both city dwellers, used to the constant hum of noise, so the thought of a few days surrounded by nothing but trees, fresh air, and silence was incredibly appealing. I imagined cozy nights by the fire, hikes through the forest, and finally getting some real rest. The drive up there was beautiful, with winding roads that took us deeper into dense woods. The sun was setting as we pulled into the cabin's gravel driveway, and it was like something out of a postcard. The cabin was small, rustic, and perched on the edge of a thick forest. There was no one else around for miles, and the quietness was almost surreal. After unloading our bags and settling in, we sat by the fire with a couple of glasses of wine, talking and laughing as we planned the next day's hike. It wasn't until around midnight that we noticed something odd, a faint noise coming from outside. It sounded like a man screaming, but Sarah was convinced it was some animal like a fox or whatever. The noise eventually stopped, and we let ourselves relax again. But as we were getting ready for bed, Sarah's face turned white. She was looking out the small window above the kitchen sink, staring into the dark woods just beyond. "Did you see that?" she whispered, backing away from the window. "See what?" I asked, my heart beginning to beat faster. She looked at me with wide eyes. I think I saw someone standing there watching us." I walked over to the window, but there was nothing, just the inky darkness of the forest. "Maybe it was the animal we heard earlier," I said, trying to keep myself calm. We locked the doors, closed all the blinds, and decided to brush it off. It had been a long drive, and we were probably just jumpy from being out in the middle of nowhere. But as we lay in our beds, the silence seemed too heavy. I could hear Sarah's breathing in the next room, each exhale and inhale. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I was awoken by the sound of footsteps outside our cabin. They circled around, crunching over the gravel, stopping beneath each window as if whoever it was peering in. I held my breath, paralyzed with fear, listening as the footsteps continued. They'd pause for a moment, then start up again, moving to the next window. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't even move. The footsteps eventually stopped, and I lay there, wide-eyed and shaking for what felt like hours. I finally fell into a restless sleep, and when I woke up, it was morning. I rushed into the living room to find Sarah already awake. She looked scared as she sat on the couch clutching a cup of coffee. "Did you hear it too?" she asked. I nodded, and we both decided to leave immediately. Whatever peaceful vacation we'd planned was no longer worth it. We packed our bags in silence, neither of us wanting to talk about what had happened. We just wanted to get out of there. As we were loading up the car, I glanced back at the cabin one last time and froze. On the dirt just outside each window, there were deep, clear footprints as though someone had been standing there watching us. Each window had a set of prints beneath it, and they were fresh. Sarah noticed them too. We didn't waste another second. We jumped in the car and sped down the mountain, only stopping once we were back in town. We never talked about it again, and neither of us has been back to that area since. There was no way that someone who was all the way out there in the middle of the night had any good intentions. I'm glad neither of us made a sound that night. Who knows what could have happened if the stranger had heard us. A few summers ago, my girlfriend Emily and I decided to go on a trip to celebrate our 3-year anniversary. We chose a remote beachside resort on an island that promised private villas, stunning ocean views, and an escape from the crowds. I still remember how excited we were on the ferry ride over, talking about the snorkeling we'd do, the meals we'd try, and how it would be a vacation we'd never forget. The resort was exactly as advertised: beautiful, isolated, and incredibly peaceful. Our villa was set right along the shoreline, with a wooden deck that opened directly onto a pristine, sandy beach. You could hear the waves lapping gently against the shore from any room in the villa. It felt like paradise. The first night we went down to the beach after dinner to stargaze. It was pitch dark except for the moon, which casted a silver glow over the water. There was no one else on the beach, and all we could hear was the soft crashing of waves. As we lay there in the sand, Emily pointed to something in the water, maybe 50 or 60 yards out. At first I thought it was a piece of driftwood just floating along the surface, but then it bobbed up and down in a way that didn't look quite right. "Is that a person?" Emily whispered, clutching my arm. I squinted, straining to see. It almost looked like someone was out there, just a head floating above the water, staring back at us. But it was too far out to make out any details, just a shape. I tried to reassure Emily, telling her it was probably just debris or a trick of the moonlight, but deep down I felt uneasy. That head wasn't moving with the current. It was perfectly still, too still for a swimmer, too round for a rock. "Come on, let's go back," I suggested, brushing it off as nothing. Emily's face told me she was spooked. The next morning, we asked a staff member if it was safe to swim out near that spot. He just laughed and assured us that the water was calm and safe, with no dangerous wildlife. Emily and I spent the day at the beach, and although we didn't see anything unusual, I couldn't shake the memory of that thing we'd seen the night before. Every so often, I'd find myself glancing out at the water, half expecting to see that head again. Later that day, we decided to snorkel. The water was crystal clear, and you could see almost to the bottom. But as we swam out farther from the shore, I began to feel disoriented. The water beneath us suddenly looked much darker, even though the sun was still shining. I looked over at Emily, and she seemed fine, happily swimming along, oblivious. Then, just as I was about to tell her we should head back, I saw something down below. It was faint at first, almost like a shadow, moving slowly along the ocean floor. I tried to focus, but every time I thought I saw it clearly, it shifted, blurring into the water. It wasn't a fish or a person. It was more like a ripple in the ocean itself, something moving with the water but not part of it. My heart raced as the shadow drifted closer, rising slowly toward the surface, toward us. Emily noticed my panic and swam over, grabbing my arm. "What's wrong?" she asked. But when I tried to explain, I couldn't find the words. How could I tell her that there was something in the water, something I couldn't even describe? We swam back to shore, and I spent the rest of the day feeling restless, my skin prickling every time I glanced out at the ocean. That night, Emily fell asleep early, exhausted from the snorkeling. But I lay awake, watching the waves through the sliding glass doors. I kept thinking about the shadow and that floating head we'd seen. Around 2 a.m., I got up to grab a glass of water, hoping it would calm me down. As I was pouring it, I looked out at the beach and froze. There, standing at the edge of the water, was a figure, a person, maybe a man, just standing there, staring out at the sea. He was completely still, his back to me, as if he was waiting for something. I wanted to wake Emily, but I didn't want to scare her. So I just stood there, watching him. And then, without turning around, the man walked forward into the water. Slowly, step by step, he disappeared beneath the waves. I waited, but he didn't come back up. The surface of the water was calm, undisturbed, as though he'd never been there. The next morning, I convinced Emily to go into town with me for the day. I wanted to get as far away from the water as possible. We spent hours wandering through local shops and exploring nearby trails, and for a while I felt safe again. But when we got back to the resort that evening, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the sand, right where I'd seen the man standing the night before, there were footprints. Bare, wet footprints leading down to the water, and then back up again, stopping directly in front of our villa. I didn't say a word to Emily, but I know she saw them too. That night, neither of us slept. Every so often, I'd hear Emily whisper, "Did you hear that?" and I'd shake my head, too scared to admit that I'd heard it too. We were supposed to stay another 2 days, but we packed up and left early the next morning, not even bothering to check out. On the ferry back, I finally told Emily everything. The head in the water, the shadow while we snorkeled, the man I'd seen walking into the ocean. She looked at me in horror and said, "Last night, I thought I heard someone outside just standing there breathing." To this day, I can't explain what we experienced. We've talked about going back to that island just to prove it was all in our heads, but I don't think we ever will. This happened last winter when my girlfriend Lily and I decided to take a last-minute trip to a mountain lodge. We both loved skiing, and Lily found a deal on a cabin rental up in a place called Silver Peak. Neither of us had heard of it before, but the photos looked incredible. There was snow-covered trees and slopes just minutes away from the cabin, and a wood-burning fireplace that would be perfect after a day on the mountain. The drive was long and winding, taking us through miles of snow-covered forest. Eventually, the GPS led us onto a small road that climbed up the side of the mountain. We passed a few scattered cabins on the way. They looked empty, dark, and abandoned. When we finally reached our destination, I couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. Our cabin was the only one with lights on, standing isolated at the end of a long, snowy path. "This place is kinda creepy, don't you think?" I asked, forcing a laugh as I carried our bags inside. Lily just rolled her eyes, brushing off my nerves. She loved the idea of an isolated getaway. To her, it was cozy and romantic. I tried to shake off my nerves and unpacked. Inside, the cabin was a bit unusual. It was older than it had looked in the photos, with dusty wooden floors, drafty windows, and walls lined with vintage ski equipment, wooden skis, a pair of frayed leather boots, and a faded black and white photo of a group of skiers in the 1950s. The photo caught my eye right away. Something about the way the skiers looked didn't sit right with me. They were smiling, but their eyes, they looked empty. "Hey, look at this," I called Lily over, pointing at the photo. She shrugged, not seeing anything strange about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We spent the next day skiing, and by the time we got back to the cabin that evening, we were exhausted. Lily started a fire and we settled in, talking and laughing. But as the night wore on, I got the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I'd glance at the photo on the wall and I swore the skiers' smiles looked wider with more intense eyes. I figured I was just tired from the slopes and let it go, because there was no way that could happen. It was just a picture after all, right? Around midnight, Lily went to bed while I stayed up reading. The fire had burned down to embers. I was just starting to doze off when I heard a noise. It was very faint at first, like a low rustling sound. It came from outside. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer wandering by, but the noise grew louder. Now it sounded like someone trudging through the snow. I glanced out the window but saw only darkness and the faint reflection of the room behind me. Just as I was about to turn away, something moved in the corner of my vision, a flash of white in the shadows near the edge of the forest. I froze and stared into the darkness. For a second, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line, dressed in white with dark shadows where their eyes should be. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I shook my head, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. I hadn't slept well, and I was probably just seeing things. But when I crawled into bed, the sense of unease stayed with me. The cabin felt colder, the silence heavier. I eventually fell into a restless sleep, only to be woken up by Lily shaking my shoulder. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Her face was pale. I listened, and then I heard it, a scratching sound coming from the front door like someone dragging their nails across the wood. I held my breath, just staring at the door. It couldn't be an animal. The sound was too precise and consistent. "We should call someone," I whispered, reaching for my phone. But of course there was no signal out here. We were completely cut off. We sat in silence, listening to the scratching, which grew louder and more insistent by the second, like whoever or whatever was on the other side was growing frustrated. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. We stayed frozen, too scared to move. But after a few minutes of silence, Lily finally relaxed. "Maybe it was just the wind," she said, though I could hear the doubt in her voice. We tried to go back to sleep, but I kept one eye on the door, waiting for the sound to return. It didn't. The next morning I found strange tracks in the snow outside the cabin and narrow marks that looked almost like scratches. They led from the front door, down the path, and disappeared into the trees. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but Lily insisted it was just an animal and convinced me to stay one more night. However, the next night, everything changed. Around 2 a.m., I was woken by a loud bang. I sat up, groggy and disoriented, and then I heard it again, heavy footsteps coming from above us. I looked at Lily, who was wide-eyed and clutching the blankets. There's an attic in this cabin, isn't there?" she whispered. I hadn't thought about it before, but she was right. There was a hatch in the ceiling of the hallway leading up to a crawl space. My stomach turned as I listened to the slow, steady footsteps moving directly above us. Without thinking, I grabbed a flashlight and crept into the hallway. The hatch was just above me, and as I pointed the flashlight up, I could see faint marks around the edges, as though it had recently been moved. Before I could turn away, the hatch creaked open. A hand reached down, bony and pale. Its fingers were impossibly long, with nails that looked like claws. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, as a face appeared in the opening. I recognized it. It was one of the skiers from the photo on the wall, staring straight at me. I ran back into the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. "We need to get out of here," I shouted. Lily was shocked but didn't argue. We grabbed our things and bolted out of the bedroom window, not stopping until we were in the car, speeding down the snowy road. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time, and what I saw shocked me to my core. There they were, the 4 skiers from the photo, except they looked dead and frozen, standing on the porch watching us leave. Their dark, empty eyes glinted in the moonlight. We didn't stop driving until we reached a town over an hour away. Neither of us could sleep, and we ended up waiting until dawn at a diner, too scared to go back until it was light. I called the rental agency the next day. It turned out we took a wrong turn, which led us to the wrong cabin. The agency said that those cabins hadn't been used in decades, which would explain the dusty interior, but it doesn't explain the figures we saw. I never found out who or what was in that cabin with us.